We keep talking about Ukraine, Ukraine, and the Russians. The Russians. But see, it's a big world out there, and we should be paying attention to China. Mhm. I mean, I've been trying to pay more attention to China. It's hard because I'm like in the middle of Kharkov, and there are all kinds of attacks and withdrawals, all kinds of military stuff going on right outside my window, literally. So it's kind of hard to break away from this that's happening here now, there, out my window. It's hard to sort of like pull back, take a step back, and look at the broader picture, the broader geopolitical picture, but it's important to pay attention to it. And I've been starting to pay attention to China in particular, and I've been paying attention to Australia. Australia, oof. As I've been reading and listening to different interviews and trying to get an idea, a sense of where we're at, and the whole Solomon Islands thing, what the hell is that all about? I mean, what's going on? And it's becoming increasingly clear that the United States is positioning Australia to be the next Ukraine. See, because what happened with Ukraine and Russia? Well, the Americans, by way of NATO and the European Union, manipulated the Ukrainians into thinking that they could actually start a war with Russia and win. Because remember, this war in Ukraine started because the Ukrainians positioned troops on the contact line with the Donbass and started shelling them in preparation for an invasion. There was going to be a full-on invasion of the Donbass. That is indisputable. At this point, all of the evidence shows it. The propaganda, of course, is trying to cover it up, but you start digging a little bit, and the evidence is overwhelming that was the plan. I mean, that's why there are roughly 60,000 troops getting encircled in the Donbass area, because those 60,000 troops were part of the larger army of 100,000 Ukrainian men who were about to invade the Donbass. The Russians just beat them to the punch, and here we are. But you see, the Americans manipulated the Ukrainians into doing this attack. The Americans, by way of NATO, by way of the European Union, egged them on, led them down the garden path. And the Ukrainians did it thinking that they'd have the full support of NATO. And when things got heavy, as they did, NATO kind of like made itself scarce now, didn't it? Huh? Yeah. So anyway, that was the method that the Americans used to get into a war with Russia. They used the Ukrainians as a proxy. The Ukrainians risked their men, their equipment, and picked a fight with the Russians. And what happened? We're seeing it. As I've said before, the war is over. Right now it's a mopping up operation. It's a complicated and mopping up operation. It'll take some time, but it's a mopping up operation. The Ukrainians were the proxy for the Americans. Now the Australians are picking a fight with the Chinese, and they are being egged on by the Americans. The Solomon Island, right, as I understand it, and you guys can correct me in the comment section if I'm wrong, but the issue is that the Chinese and the Solomon Islands are getting into an agreement, and part of that agreement will require Chinese security personnel to be policing some of the investments and some of the initiatives that the Chinese are going to be carrying out in the Solomon Islands. The Chinese have no intention of setting up a permanent military base or something like that, or a naval base or something like that. That's just fantasy. That's just make-believe. It's not reality. You look at what the Chinese and the Solomon Islands are actually getting involved in, and it has nothing to do with establishing a permanent base. Certainly, you could argue that the relationship that they are developing by way of this initial treaty might eventually, in 10 years, 20 years, lead to some sort of military base in the Solomon Islands. But right now, for the foreseeable future, for the next 5 years, no, it's not. And anybody who says otherwise is lying, because it's not. I mean, like I said, you could say that maybe in 10 years, but now, or 5 years, no. But the Australians are freaking out over this whole thing. Why do you think that that's happening? Why do you think that the Australians are having a complete meltdown over this stuff? It's because the Americans are egging them on. The Americans are egging on the Australians And the Australians have become, well, the Australians are being manipulated by the Americans into goading a war with China, exactly like Ukraine was goaded into a war with Russia. Now, the fact is that the Australians, brave as they are insignificant in size compared to Australia. They can't take China. Okay, excuse me. The Australians, as I said, they are insignificant in terms of size to China. They can't take on China. And so the Australians, by goading the Chinese and pretending that the Solomon Islands, that are 2,000 miles away from Australian shores, is of some sort of strategic importance, which is absurd. Just look at a map. Well, it's clear that they're being manipulated by the Americans. And so the Australians have to figure out what is their best interest: to be manipulated by the Americans into a war with China, or to break with the Americans and figure out a way to have their own security arrangement with China. But of course, that moment has passed with the AUKUS partnership, Australia, UK, US. A terrible acronym, by the way. AUKUS, it sounds a little bit too close to fuck us, doesn't it? Because that's what it is insofar as Australia is concerned. Australia bros, that treaty, that organization, that security arrangement, that is the cornerstone of your doom. And the reason is because it doesn't look to your neighbors like Indonesia, like China, like any of the other countries there. It doesn't look like a security arrangement, like a defensive arrangement. It looks like an aggressive arrangement. And Indonesia in particular, which is the biggest neighbor of Australia, is looking at this very, very nervously. They don't like it. And what's this doing to Indonesia? It's driving them closer to China. And so you see, you are creating your own problems with this alliance with the UK and the US that doesn't serve your strategic interests. It serves the strategic interests of the United States, because the strategic interests of the United States is to never allow any other country to become as powerful as the US. And China is becoming as powerful as the US in leaps and bounds, not just economically. Economically, China has already surpassed the United States, militarily and geopolitically. And that's why the United States is manipulating Australia into this position of becoming an enemy, not just of China, but of all the neighboring countries, countries that are in Australia's best interest to be friendly with. But the Americans are manipulating you. And it's becoming increasingly clear that the Chinese have figured out a way how to ignore the Americans insofar as Taiwan is concerned. And that the Americans are also realizing that they don't want to go head-to-head against the Chinese, not militarily, because they are too vulnerable. Their aircraft carrier battle groups, paradoxically, are sitting ducks for Chinese attacks. And so they realize that this enormous power that they have in these carrier battle groups is at the same time an enormous vulnerability. And so the Americans are realizing that they can't really use them. And so they have to use a proxy. And the proxy is Australia. The United States does this all the time. They did it with Ukraine. And back earlier, they did it with Iraq. When they helped Iraq against Iran, Iraq was the proxy for the United States to really stick it to the Iranians during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. And before that, South Vietnam. The Americans have this nasty habit of making friends with some country, giving it weapons and money, and the country falls into this false sense that they are America's best friend. And they go ahead and do America's bidding. And then when things go south, when things go belly up, the United States abandons them to their fate. And these countries discover, America is just a fair weather friend. America is just using them. America doesn't really care about their fate and if they're annihilated by the enemy that the United States was trying to harm. Look what happened to South Vietnam. Look what happened to Iraq. Look what's happening to Ukraine. Australia bros, that's going to happen to you. Don't tell me that you weren't forewarned.